Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to display the health value on the screen, but to do that, we first need to have a discussion about strings. We'll talk about C-style strings, as well as the standard library string type. Let's get started. Now this is a C-style string. That keyword char, sometimes called char, is the keyword for the character type. You'll notice that sword is an array of this type. Now on the right side of the assignment operator is the string sword in double quotes. This is known as a string literal, and it can be used to populate an array of chars. We don't need to place an integer in the brackets because the compiler is capable of deducing the size of this array based on the length of this string literal. Now what you don't see, and what's placed in the array at the end, is something called the null character. We say that C-style strings are null terminated, as they always contain this null character at the end. So here is the array, depicted in boxes, and in each box is a character. Character literals are surrounded by single quotes, not to be confused with string literals. And the very last character here is the null character. Much like the newline character, it looks like two characters, but it's actually a single character, which we call the null character. C-style strings are what we had to use in the C language before C++ came around. And they're still used in the C++ language, but as a programmer, you're a lot more capable if you're familiar with the string class, which exists in the C++ standard library. To use the string class, you include the header file string. Notice the pointy brackets. Remember, standard library header files are special. They get pointy brackets. Now, the standard string is a class in the standard library that contains a C-style string under the hood. That's where it stores the actual string, but it's also much more versatile and contains functions. This is how we declare a new variable of the string type. Notice the string keyword is prefixed by std and the scope resolution operator. This std is the name of a namespace, which is a space which contains code, functions, and variables, which can be accessed by using the name of the namespace along with the scope resolution operator. Here we're declaring a string called damage and initializing it with a string literal. So deep under the hood of the damage string instance, there's a C-style string that contains the characters that spell damage. But the string type has special abilities, like the append function. Notice we're taking the damage variable and calling append, passing in another string literal. This function will take that string literal and stick it at the end of the string, so now the string contains those extra characters passed in. Now what if we want to append a number instead of a string? Well, the standard library contains a function called toString, which can take a number and it returns a standard string. Now, the C-style character array contained within that string will have the characters equivalent to the number you passed in. So we'll have a string with the characters 1, 2 in this case. Then calling append with that value will result in a string that contains the string equivalent of that number appended at the end. Now let's say we have a float and we pass that into toString, which we then pass into append. ToString will return a string object that contains the string equivalent of that number, but because this is a float, we have lots of digits. So our damage variable in this case may be more digits than we care to store. But there exists yet another version of the append function which has multiple parameters. The second parameter is an integer designating the starting point of the string we're passing in to append, and the third parameter is the number of characters we'd like to keep. So if we choose 5 here, then we're going to append 12.45, as the decimal point counts as a character. So say we have a standard string and we'd like to display it on the screen. Well, Raylib has a drawText function, but this function requires a C-style string. That's the first parameter. The second parameter is the X position, the third is the Y position, the fourth is the font size, and the fifth is the color. Now we want to work with standard strings in order to manipulate them with the functions that we saw in the previous slides. So how can we pass in a standard string to the drawText function when drawText requires a C-style string? Well, the standard string type has a pretty handy function. It's C_str, but I refer to it as C_string. And it does exactly what you think. It returns a C-style string. So now that we've seen these handy functions, let's set ourselves up so we can draw the health to the screen. So here in the main function, at the top, we're going to include the string header file. So now we can use the standard string. Now let's scroll down into the while loop. I'd like to go down to the point just after we've drawn the props. Here is where I'd like to draw the character's health, but I'd like to make an if-else statement that checks to see if the character's alive, because if the character's not alive, I'd like to display game over instead. So here's how we're going to set it up. I'm going to say if not knight.getAlive. So if the character's alive variable is false, we'll make it into this if statement, and we'll also have the else case. So the if is the character is not alive case, and the else is the character is alive case. Now, if the character's not alive, we're simply going to call drawText, and for the string literal, we'll pass in game over. For posX, I'll use 55.f, for posY, I'll use 45.f, and for font size, I'll use 40, and color will be red. Now, if the character's not alive, then we don't need to do anything else that comes after this code in the while loop. In other words, we'd like to cut to the end of this iteration of the while loop and start the next one. You can do this using the continue keyword. If you use the continue keyword inside of a loop, once the flow of execution reaches the continue, the rest of the loop body is ignored and the next iteration of the loop will start. Now, before we hit the continue, we should call end drawing so the window is cleared appropriately. So this takes care of the case when the character is no longer alive. But what about the else case when the character is still alive? This is where we'd like to draw the character's health. So this will be your challenge. In the else case for the if statement, you're going to draw the character's health to 2 digits. You'll first create a standard string called knight's health, initialized with the string literal health with a colon and a space at the end. Now you're going to use getHealth along with the standard toString function and the string's append function in order to append to the knight's health string the value of the character's health. You'll then use drawText and pass in the string you created, knight's health, only you'll need to call the CString function since drawText requires a C-style string. For the rest of the parameters of drawText, use the same parameters we used when we called drawText in order to draw game over to the screen. Namely, posX will be 55, posY will be 45, font size will be 40, and color will be red. Pause the video and do this now. Okay, so the first step is to create a standard string. We need to use std with the scope resolution operator, followed by string, and we're going to call this knight's health. Now we can initialize this with a string literal, and we'll use health with a colon and a space at the end. Now we're going to take knight's health and use the append function. And what we want to append is the value of the knight's health, but we need to use the standard toString function. And what we're passing into toString is the value of the knight's health, which we'll get using knight.getHealth. Now the version of the append function we're going to use is the one that takes 3 parameters, allowing us to select part of the string passed in as the first parameter to append. We'll start at the first character and we'll keep 5 characters. That way we'll have 4 digits including a decimal point. Next, we're going to call drawText. Now, the first parameter needs to be a C-string, and we're going to use knight's health, only we have to use the C-string function in order to get a C-string from it. Now, for posX, we'll use 55. For posY, we'll use 45. For font size, we'll use 40. And for color, we'll use red. Okay, we can test this out. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so there's our health, and you'll see that we're getting 100.0. That's because we chose to keep 5 characters from this string, and as soon as we go down below 100, then we get 2 digits, a decimal, and 2 more digits. Now, because we're drawing the enemy after we're drawing the text, you can see that the enemy is rendered on top of this text, which actually looks pretty cool. And the final thing we can test is printing game over when health reaches 0. So we can let that happen, and there we go. So in summary, we printed the character's health value to the screen, and that involved the use of strings. So we first had a discussion about C-style strings, and then we learned about the standard string type. We also learned about some special functions like the toString function and the strings append and CString functions. We're almost done with this game. In the next video, we're going to wrap this up by adding multiple enemies to the level. See you soon!